Okay, guys, we are recording. It is Tuesday afternoon. Right now, it is 10 to 4 at time of recording, which is about 12 hours after I woke up. And then I was on my way to you in Cheltenham, at which point, halfway there, I got a phone call about dizziness and falling downstairs and, yeah, sort of general excitement. Which I'm smiling now and I'm able to record, which is a pretty good indication that things are okay. But things were a little bit hairy at home earlier on. Everything's okay. There are some damaged arms and some damaged ears from where certain adults fell over or fell down. But we're okay. We're okay. So it was an unfortunate intrusion, but I think on balance it was the right decision for me to come back. Namely because, all the little children that are here. So that's why I couldn't be with you today. The shorthand version, that is. So sincere apologies. It would be really, really brilliant to have been with you in person, because the session that we did at the end of last week, coupled with the session that we would have been doing today, really sit quite neatly together. Really what we do in this session, the session exploring ethnicities, and where are we? There? There on the... No, that side. That way. Perception. This idea of nationalism, ethnicity and boundaries, that's not the session title. That's actually the title of a conference that I found the cover for online. So I've just stolen that. But it does sort of neatly deal with the narrative that we're exploring, which is nationalism and ethnicities. And of course, boundaries come into that. But in the context of the Balkans... boundaries are a really blurred and fluid concept. I suppose in the session that we would have been exploring today, we weren't so much going to be dealing with the conclusion of the process of nation building, because, as I'm sure you all have the general knowledge and awareness of, the territory that we're dealing with is far from concluded in terms of territorial division and boundaries as we move through our period of history. Really, this is something that in many respects isn't concluded until well into the 20th century, and arguably it's still quite a fluid process today in some states. So this isn't necessarily going to be a session which says this is how... just to take the image up above me, not all of the Balkans, just a little snapshot of it. This isn't to say this is where Hungarian identity comes from, or Albanian identity, or identities for Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not to say that this is where those nations emerge, but it's to understand the complexities of the situations in that part of Europe for where we sit in the chronology of this module. What I'm going to do in this particular recording is, I don't know, we're probably only going to record for about an hour or so, I think. I'm not going to make you sit through 3 hours of me sat in my office chatting away to you. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. I'm going to use the slides as they appear on Moodle, so you can sort of follow them through without worrying. I mean, I'm not going to go through the process of deleting the slides that I'm not going to talk about today, but you get a sense of the sort of the flow of the session. Excuse me. I'm also going to record this in one sitting as much as possible. Children may come knocking on the door before long, but oh geez, there's hair in the tea. I did take a chance to shower before this, so I've got there's hair everywhere. Anyway, so we'll do what we can, and then I'm going to set up a discussion forum on the Moodle pages. I do that with not huge optimism that you guys are going to contribute to the discussion session, but it would be nice if you dropped in and threw some ideas at the chat, and I'm more than happy to discuss things in that way. What I'm also thinking of doing for the 4-week break that we've got, just to sort of keep momentum going, I was thinking of trying something a little bit different and maybe doing some live chat sessions on some different platforms. We can do a little bit of experimentation. So we might do some Twitch sessions to do some discussions about the assessments coming up, and that is what I was going to talk about at the start of today's particular session. That is to just highlight that, you know, the second part of the portfolio is live. The texts that I am recommending you look at are available for consideration. Oh no, sorry, now I remember what I was going to do. I was going to go from this onto the Moodle page, so I'm not going to do that now because I don't want to jump around too much. But if you go into Moodle, you'll appreciate that there are, I think, 7 or 8 texts that I have suggested that you have a look at. You are not necessarily restricted to those texts. You can approach me and suggest other texts to explore, but you're going to need to convince me of the merits of those texts. The one thing that I really wanted to stress in the session today about the second part of the portfolio is what it says up on screen here, that you have a small amount of words, and it's recommended that you focus on a chapter from within those texts. In the past, people have tried to tackle the entire publication, the entire book, and it's possible, but really hard to do well within the word limit that you've got. So, the main piece of advice at this point is to focus in on a specific chapter or a specific element within the arguments explored in those texts. So that's my recommendation. I think what we will do at some point over the coming month, I haven't quite decided if it's going to be through Teams or on the old YouTube channel or through Twitch, but we'll do a session where we'll have like a open online drop-in session where you can throw questions at me about the assessments. I'll swing it back to you, and give you some feedback in terms of whatever questions you may have, but in an open forum. So those commentaries that you might have, and my answers are something that can be shared with the entire group. Okay, but more about that as we move on. For today, we're going to be focusing on this narrative of nationalism within the Balkans. And one of the main reasons I like focusing a specific session on the geographical mess that is the Balkans is that we are dealing with, for a European context, quite a unique set of circumstances. There are a number of specific reasons as to why the evolution of nationalism in the context of the Balkans takes a much longer time period, a much longer trajectory than that which we see in any of the Western European states. You push up to sort of Central Northern Europe as well, and indeed you push out to what's happening in a Russian context. Obviously, the chronologies of what's happening in Russia are again distinct, but when the nationalism narrative does kick off, it's, I suppose, a little bit more clean or clear-cut than what happens in the Balkans by comparison. And some of the reasons for that are covered in this slide. I mean, we don't necessarily need to do that in order. In many respects, the point towards one from the bottom is the most important one, and that is this distant relationship with ruling Ottoman sultans. That is to say that much of the Balkans, for much of the time period that we're dealing with, does come under Ottoman authority. You know, when we talked about Greece at the start of last week's session in relation to the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon friezes, ideas about repatriation of cultural material, I was stressing that for the Greeks, one of the very first things they do when they secure independence is try to regather, retain, secure ownership of their cultural material, namely the great works of classical architecture which had previously been removed. So that is a major focus point, but it's only one that starts as we get into sort of the second and the third decades of the 19th century. So as we're moving into this century, Ottoman authority is, I suppose, the norm of governance for many of these proto-states. That's the form of control and authority that the peoples within this territory are most familiar with. What that means is you don't get quite the same sort of, and not that it's the cleanest of breaks, but in terms of the revolutionary outbreaks that we're seeing through much of the rest of Western and Central Europe, it's more focused with changing forms of authority. So in France, we have a monarchy, and the back and forth over should there be a monarchy, constitutional monarchy, no monarchy, and then back to constitutional, back to something that isn't particularly constitutional at all, and back and forth. So in many respects, the focal point of the nationalism break in France is focused around monarchy. For some of the other European states, and Italy's on this map, and we can talk about that. Much of Italian tensions, if you like, in terms of identity, are focused with what's up in the north of that image above us, that being Austria. So looking to break with foreign influences. But I suppose you could make the same argument for what's happening in the Balkans, except the influence is much closer in an Italian context. So Italian tensions with France, it's right on the border. Italian tensions with Austria, it's right on the border. The tensions that you see in the Balkans in relation to the Ottomans is both practically, geographically isolated. There is a very distant relationship in terms of ruling authority. But also within the Balkans, you have such a complexity of identity composition that the idea of sort of forging a unified response to this pressing external authority is a lot harder to realise. And I say that knowing full well the complexities of what's happening within Italy, the complexities of what's happening within Prussia, that to be Germany. But by comparison, the narrative within the Balkans is far more complex again. Within Italy, we explore a number of distinct states. Those states, though, are not clearly defined on what we might describe as ethnic lines. So ethnicity it invites a different degree of complexity when it comes to identity. It's far more contentious. There's far more invested in it. It's not just a question of saying we don't like people from the north. It's we are fundamentally distinct from our neighbours, even though we may share kinship groups. So the Balkans is both a narrative of kinship and distinct ethnic identities. So you may have what you might want to describe as a distinct cultural identity with different cultural practices right next door to you. But because of the nature of that's the wrong way to describe it, because of the nature of people mobility, migration within the Balkans, there's a lot of overlap in terms of kinship, kin groups throughout this territory. So it's very complex in terms of its cultural composition in that respect, and it's messy in relation to the external authority of the Ottomans. Tied to that, we say here Western Europe's political, intellectual, cultural, urban middle class failed to emerge. That is to say, when we look at Western Europe, France, Britain in particular, we've talked about artisans and the emergence of artisans. Oh, excuse me. Being awake for 12 hours already and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon will catch up with me. I apologise if there's liberal yawning. I'll do my best to check it. That's why I'm on the green tea at this time of day. You don't get the emergence of an artisanal class in the same way. So for France, we know that the emergence of artisans are important in terms of there being a distinct middle class. And with a middle class, you get middle class preoccupations. You also get a greater sense of literacy, social mobility, and the movement of ideas in relation to those people. That's not something that's really happening in the Balkans at this time. And we have a lack of nobility as well. So, nobility, I suppose, is important in terms of ideas of class, wealth, influential individuals who may both be pushing against and supporting notions of the state, but you have those key visible players who are playing an influential role one way or the other in terms of the changing political landscape and the emergence of a coherent national narrative. That's something that's, broadly speaking, not as applicable in the context of the Balkans. Now, of course, there are educated individuals coming through and becoming more prominent leadership figures, but critically, point at the bottom, no secular education within the Balkans. France definitively has a break from the church. In Italy, the role of the church is weakened. In a Prussian context, the church is still there, but in terms of its influence and grip on education, school settings, universities, it's being challenged very clearly. The Balkans, the role of the church is far more profound, influential, and I suggest robust. That is to say that what school children are being taught, what are some of the narratives coming out of a university setting, are heavily influenced by church. So there is a different set of motivations at play here. In a French setting, one of the ways in which children in a school setting are being not so much manipulated, but I suppose educated. That's the word we're looking for. The way they're being educated is in such a way that exposes school children and young adults to ideas of nation, the ideas of sacrifice for nation, the idea of challenging state tied to monarchy. In a more religious focused setting, there isn't the same sort of preoccupation with pushing against the state. There's a greater emphasis on the acknowledgement on the importance of religious practice, duty, service, these sorts of narratives. And whilst that might be a little bit cliched, these are undeniable parts of the narrative that we're dealing with here. So, very distinct cultural and political factors at play, which means that what's happening in the Balkans is profoundly different to that which we see anywhere else. Now, some of the other features that are important, to be aware of, is the way in which the Ottomans govern territories. Now, there are some interesting distinctions about the way in which the Ottomans rule or govern, and I think that's probably the better way to describe it. They govern these territories. There are plenty of instances of rebellion which is met with extreme military force, and I'll probably jump through the slides at one point to take you to one of those examples. But generally speaking, the Ottomans govern from a distance. You can almost draw some comparisons to, and I draw this comparison being able to talk about it. You may be less familiar about this or with this, but there are comparisons to the way in which the Roman Empire governs. That is to say that the Roman Empire governed by something that in a British context was known as the civitas system of governance. That is to say, they established new settlements for tribal groups and essentially put those tribal groups in charge of their own destiny. The civitas capitals were essentially operated by what we think was an elected body of local tribal representatives who were representing the people. So there was essentially a tribal council that governed the state on behalf of the empire. Now, what we have in the Ottoman Empire is this system of mille. And this runs for a significant period of time. Now, this isn't quite the same thing as the Roman Empire, but what it is allowing degrees of self-governance within the Ottoman Empire drawn on ethno-religious lines. Established on point 4, centuries of mille existence established religion as the primary criteria for group identity. So within the Ottoman Empire, there was what you might be inclined to describe as religious tolerance. Ottoman Empire is pretty big, pretty spread out. Managing empires is a difficult thing to do, and it's even harder if you start dictating to people that they can no longer worship in the way that they are familiar with, to be respectful of their specific and local forms of religious worship and practice. The Ottomans largely respect this. And so where you see ethnic Christian groups, they are by and large allowed to continue their practice the way they would, to a degree govern themselves by their own, broadly speaking, religious forms of rule and priority. And we see this applied to a host of distinct religious groups across this territory. We see some specific regional areas in which Jewish communities are given degrees of self-governance. So as a consequence of that, and I don't want to push this too hard, but there are clearly religious freedoms being respected within the Ottoman Empire, but people are being gathered and sort of compartmentalized on religious grounds. So it's not so much people being gathered on the grounds of, if we were to take the transition from 18th into 19th century Europe, it's not to say there are Austrian people there, there are French people here, there are Prussian Germanic people there, there are English British people up there. It's not being organised on those lines. It's being organised on grounds of religious alignment, and that is giving you, as I say, your primary criteria for group identity. You're being organised based on, you are recognising yourself in relation to a religious practice and identity far more so than a territorial identity. So that's again an important distinction to draw through. Tied with that, again, there are these little sound bites that I'll throw in every now and again. I say first, it's critical to note that the Balkans represents one of the most ethnically, linguistically and religiously problematic regions of the world. And yes, that holds true. It is a very complex cultural landscape, which is a point only reinforced by that which we see in terms of the ethnic political tensions that you see breaking out in the 20th century. You know, in terms of conflict within mainland Europe, the thing that sort of played out prior to what's happening right now was predominantly the Balkans Wars, and essentially forms of civil war that you see breaking out in that period as we work towards sort of the latter days of the Soviet Union and the sort of the consequences of the breakup of that political territory and the cultural responses that take place within that as those former ethnic and religious groups sort of vie for their political relevance and existence in the aftermath of that breakup. So I think we've seen the legacy, the political tension legacy of that in recent years. But this just gives you a sort of a taste of the complexity, and up above where we've got the breakdown of Yugoslavia as was, you can see within that the mass amounts of distinct identities here. But this period-specific map for the latter part of the 19th century gives you a sense of where the Ottoman Empire still holds on in terms of influence. So Greece towards the south by this point has that period of independence, but as we push up, we have places like Albania, that which would become Macedonia. Pushing further north, Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, coupled within that mess, Romania, or Romania as it's going to be towards the right, and the breakdown of those territories, Bulgaria, sort of sandwiched in the middle. This is a territory that is still heavily influenced by an Ottoman Empire in its death throes. You know, the Ottoman Empire is sort of on the verge of collapse at this point. It's being pushed heavily by Russia, who we see manifest in the top. Where are we? I can't really point to the map, it's in the wrong place, but towards the top right of the map. Can I show it here with the mouse? Yeah, so up here, Romania and of course, Russia and Crimea identified on this map. They're part of this narrative. They're on the borders. It has that influence in terms of this territory and tensions playing out in and around here. You'll note there's nothing up here that will be marketed as Ukraine, but we will talk about that in the last session of the calendar year. So you'd be right to question where it is at this point in terms of the chronologies. It's not really being recognised as a clear identity, but we will cover that in time. So that just gives you a sense of some of the elements of that which we'd call the Balkans, and worth saying that apart from some geographic boundaries, you're dealing with some very fluid borders here. Indeed, the notion of borders in many respects it's a Western European concept that doesn't sit particularly well here. Things are fluid, and this is that fluidity is visible in the mobility of people. You are primarily dealing with a mobile population. Now, just going through this one fairly quickly, this is just a slide just to reinforce the fact that at this point in time, some scholars only clearly identify 7 nations as we come into the 19th century, that being England, France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Portugal and the Netherlands. Germany, Italy not even held within that community. But at the same point in time, at least 20 non-dominant ethnic groups, the vast majority of which we're finding within the Balkans. So if you appreciate that the narrative within, in particular France, certainly Germany, Italy, Denmark and the Netherlands, it's far from clear cut. This is still a messy, evolving nationalistic landscape. Appreciate that for the Balkans you have clear, complex ethnic identities, which will in time push towards a national narrative, but we're not there yet. I'll push past this because we've already sort of talked about the complexity of the Ottoman Empire. You get a sense of the scale of it from this image and sort of the height of its powers. You see how far it's pushing in. Really sort of pushing right up. I mean, you see there. I mean, if we sorry, I'll bring the mouse back in. If you look how far we're going into territory that is pushing, right up to northern extents, where there's tension between Russia and the Ottoman Empire along here, but a really extensive territory, which of course, if we look to the south, is pushing all the way across into what we would recognise as Spain today. So a vast empire. And it struggles in the same way that all vast empires do. There's a lot of different cultural identities vying for relevance within this landscape. And that affords pushback. We'll see it most clearly in relation to Serbia. Within this particular... within this particular geographical territory. But the main thing I wanted to highlight was things like Millet as a form of governance and the religious freedoms that operate within this. And we can push past this as well because you, I am confident, have your familiarity with this narrative, certainly in relation to Greece. In terms of things that we've looked at so far, we know that Greece has already made that push for independence. We know that chronologically a lot of the great cultural works of Greece have been sold off prior to this point. And in terms of what we're looking at, the Parthenon is the thing up at the top of this image in the background. Not so much the foreground. The Acropolis is the thing that's up high, overlooking the landscape. But this deals with the Greek campaign for independence. As much on religious lines as it is on national identification lines, we should stress, perhaps. But nonetheless, you might remember last week I stressed that when Greek national identity really comes to the fore, it's more after independence has been secured that an emphasis on a culturally distinctive nationalistic narrative comes through, the pursuit of the return of marbles and things like that. However, within the chronology, Serbia actually comes before this. Serbia makes a push and a successful push for regional autonomy a little bit earlier, in 1815. So, sorry, I jumped ahead too far. So just be aware that there are attempts being made to secure political autonomy or political independence prior to the sort of the fall of the empire much later in this century. Now, there is a distinction here. This is not nation building from places like Serbia, and it's questionable whether it's true nation building from Greece at this time as well. It's definitely identity groups wanting to self-govern, but there is a distinction. Self-governance is not necessarily nationalism. You can have a push for wanting to govern yourself without an overt nationalistic provocation or preoccupation. More often than not, those two things do combine, but they don't have to combine. So just be aware of that distinction as well. And in terms of the Serbian narrative, I would suggest that there are more nationalistic narratives that we're going to see in latter stages of this campaign, if you like. And certainly a more overt nationalist narrative will be pursued once we get out of the aftermath of the pursuit of Serbian political autonomy. But we'll come on to that a little bit later. I'll make sure to jump around to get that in our slides for this first hour or so. Now, I've already mentioned this word, that being kinship, as being important to understand the Balkans. I say here this is a model of governance that we see in Herzegovina and Montenegro. We talk about Albania as well. Kinship recognises extended families. So probably two or three things that we really need to settle in terms of how the Balkans are operating. One is that there is territorial organisation on behalf of the Ottomans. So the Ottomans are saying, this is a territory which will be governed along ethno-religious lines, okay? And there's another territory that'll be governed on ethno-religious lines. It leaves you with a map above, which is blocks of landscape. So take Yugoslavia, throw it away, and look at the complexities that's happening below. A Croatian territory, a Bosnian territory, a Serbian territory. These geographical units are useful in terms of governance, but what do they actually mean to the people within them? Within those territories, the perceived authority sits within family units. You have very large, extended, mobile family groups within these territories, which may well be saying, well, okay, the Ottomans think there's a boundary up above us and there's a clear line on a map somewhere. We don't give a crap about that. What we care about is we have extended family. And our extended family, you might have a line here. Most of our extended family is on this bit of the territory, but we've actually got quite a few family members over here. And it is our custom to migrate and to trade and to move goods across this conceptual boundary. So for many, the idea of boundaries and borders was quite alien. Those boundaries and borders are adopted later on, but as we start to work our way through the century, it is it's a model that doesn't really work particularly well for governance within the Balkans, because a mobile form of kinship is far more traditional and common. So mobility of these large family groups is important. In a sense, you sort of get it illustrated in this image here. You see these large, and the terminology that's probably more familiar for this territory is these caravans of people, this mobility of large family groups who are migrating, not necessarily tied to a physically fixed point all the way through the calendar year. There may all be familiar places in which people gather at strategic or religious or practical in relation to trade, harvests, seasonality, that sort of thing, that people may visit year after year. But the mobility of communities is an important part. So again, reinforcing distinctions that the model of identity building is quite distinct here. And there is this narrative about the Balkans that it ties to this idea of earth culture. That one quotation exploring the idea of Balkan man. I apologise for the misogyny within this quote. I think this is from an early 80s source. So that gives you the distinction. Balkan man, we have observed, was until recently an earth man. Like other man of the world, that should be men, but a product of Neolithic cultures bound religiously, psychologically, and economically to the soil and space around him. Again, this is to say that you're dealing with agricultural communities that are governed by seasonality. Seasonality and religion. They're not governed by the idea of there are Bosnian people here, there are Serbian people over there, and that's our distinctions. No. It's governed by season, religion, belief, and, critically, tradition, which is something that plays its part in relation to kinship, really importantly. There's a child knocking at the door outside, so I'm going to pause here. I had such beautiful momentum, so I'm going to pause and then pick it up on the next slide. I will be back. For you, I'll be back instantaneously. For me, could be an hour or two. Let's see what happens. Okay. I think that's about 3 hours later than when we picked things up. It is now early evening and I'm looking out at kind of a nice sunset. It's mostly haze and pollution. But nonetheless, it's kind of pretty. So where were we? We were about 2/3 of the way through what I wanted to record for this session. So we're in the home stretch. So hopefully you took the opportunity of my interruption to refresh yourselves and do a bit of the wider reading. So where we are now is picking up on, we were just we'll try and bring the previous slide up. So that was it. So we were looking at the sort of the chronology of Balkans culture, just highlighting the fact that many academic treatments of ethnicities within the Balkans highlight that there is a deep-rooted, almost ancestral culture to the way in which Balkan society operates. A major emphasis on what we might describe as connections to almost prehistoric rootways of life. That there's a sort of a concentration of peoples within this particular geographical territory that can be traced back at the very least across sort of multiple generations, if not indeed into prehistory as well. And Brailsford's comment here just sort of reinforces that the real religion of the Balkans, something more deep-rooted, older, more elemental than Christianity itself. And if you're playing into that sort of territory, then you are taking this into prehistory quite comfortably. Bridges the intervening centuries and links in pious succession the modern peasant to the heathen ancestor who wore the same costumes, led the same life in the same fields. That it's described as sort of a primitive sorrow, this primitive connection, if you like. This earth people, the earth culture of the Balkans, just reinforcing that you have this deep-rooted connection to the territory that we explore in the context of the Balkans. So not necessarily a deep-rooted connection to the idea of a nation or a particular place, but the territory as a whole. A sort of a landscape in which there is the performance of culture. And of course, many agricultural communities, especially those involving livestock, involve the process of transhumance. That is the movement of animals through landscapes. And that means that you're moving from one place to another, different grazing grounds, different landscapes in which you know your livestock's going to be safe and secure during winter. And that creates traditional practice and custom, and arguably that is, as a cultural practice, as if not more important than formalized religious worship, which of course is subject to change and interpretation. Custom based on centuries of practice, something quite different. Now, coupled with that notion of an ancient, deep chronology for communities within the Balkans, we also have this. Now, I always refer to this as Zadruga, and I always give it a little spin on the accent. Truth be told, I've never heard Zadruga spoken out loud, so I do apologise annually if the pronunciation of this is off. Always apologise. Hopefully we're correct. I'm not sure how many other ways it could be pronounced. So we go with Zadruga. Zadruga essentially relates to the family connections that we have within the Balkans. So here, point 2, families, usually comprising 2 distinct units living within one household. And the image that you see here, obviously, is sort of at the tail end of our time period, but it's highlighting the way in which Zadruga works. It's these family connections that create these great sprawling cultural groups that are all connected. And going back to something I mentioned at the very start of the first part of this recording, which was kinship. Fundamental point of reference and importance within Balkans community. We stress here over 85% of the population in the Balkans rural. So a more agricultural, agrarian, you might even refer to it as a peasant community if you wanted to use that sort of language. And the third point, the tribal way of life pre-1912 for Montenegro, northern Albania. Here, until recent decades, this tribal region probably represented the most ancient social structure still extant in Europe. And citing at the very bottom that it was semi-nomadic. A point that I was drawing reference to earlier in relation to the process of transhumance, the movement of animals. It's a good word for you to remember, transhumance. I'm not sure how much practice or how much opportunity you'll get to use it, but keep it in there. Useful for future reference. What's highlighted here is that there is a traditional way of life that goes beyond sort of a memory. It's intergenerational. Is it going back into prehistory? Well, I mean, if you want to take it back into prehistory, you're dealing with more nomadic cultures, more nomadic traditions. So at least certain practices and ways of life tied to agriculture are at the very least going to be consistent from a prehistoric context through to, as we say here, pre-1912. So you have this deep connection and deep grounding between people and landscape. Always remember, big distinction between people and nation, people and state. This is people and landscape. And it's just highlighting that there is this this interconnected nature between peoples within the Balkans and their territory. Now, of course, if you have situations where that's under threat, you may well invite the idea that you would start to defend that, and you put investment and value in both the people and the landscape of which you are part of, and out of that can be born nationalism, which we may well draw reference to in a little bit. But before we draw out some more specific examples, because I think before I got interrupted, I probably recorded about 30-40 minutes, and I wanted to add another 20 to 30 of the material that I had here. You know, it's the Balkans. We could easily talk for, a week on this. But I wanted to just sort of set the scene in terms of you understanding the cultural composition of the Balkans, and then give you one really good case study where we start seeing what we would think of as nationalism begin to come to the fore. But before we do that, there are a couple of other cultural points of reference to emphasize in relation to the Balkans, and one of those is this: millennialism. Now, millennialism sort of manifests in lots of different ways, but more commonly, it's part of a Christian practice of worship and belief. Millennialism isn't exactly tied to the millennium or a millennium, that change in the calendar. What it is the belief and conviction that there is a sort of a great and profound change on the horizon, that I think you sort of more associate it with Sorry, words gone out of my head. Judgment Day, sort of like pre-Judgment Day, signs leading up to this momentous transitional point that will see, either the world change, the world destroyed, coming of Christ again, all these sorts of things. Profoundly significant, symbolic events tied to the Christian belief system. This was of particular importance within the context of the Balkans as well. So, whilst earlier on I cited that you can't really compare the Balkans to, say, France in terms of the political, social elites, monarchies, that sort of thing. It's a profoundly different social structure. But what the Balkans was culturally or religiously prepared for was these seismic shifts in the landscape. Now, of course, what's happening in a broader context? Broader context, we've had the French Revolution. That's something that is taking or has taken place. Napoleonic Wars, pretty sizable changes taking place. Other things that we can throw into the mix, the Enlightenment itself. The introduction of this new philosophical approach to appreciating the world, appreciating the position of people, mankind within the environment, within a spiritual context, even challenging the notion of spirituality in its broader sense. This is also playing it out. And another important qualification, and why the context I provided earlier is so important, certain things happen in certain places at different times. I teach on the Iron Age in my other job. And people often ask me, when does the Iron Age start? And I'm always at pains to stress, Iron Age starts in different times in different places. It's not a fixed date. It's something that conceptually moves around across geography and in turn over time. The Enlightenment is something quite similar. Enlightenment reaches different places at different points in time. And I think you can make a pretty good argument that the Enlightenment, as we would recognise it, really sort of beds in within the Balkans, far more so in our time period of study, that is, than any earlier phase. I mean, it's certainly there, it's moving around, but in terms of acceptance, in terms of the idea of it becoming a point of reference within educational institutions, universities, for instance, really the period that we're looking at for this module is where that becomes of far greater relevance and critically influence within the history and chronology of the Balkans and its trajectory towards nationalism, or the adoption of it. Now, you start clipping these things together. A belief and conviction in millennialism, a profound change. Something momentous is going to alter, which will impact heavily on the world that we or they are living in. The arrival of the Enlightenment and that shift in philosophical thinking could well be a manifestation of that. The French Revolution could be a manifestation of it. Something that the Ottoman Empire does within its period of rule could be something within it. The point is, people were prepared for a major seismic change. And of course, the big change that's taking place more broadly in the 19th century is the prevalence of revolution, but revolution tied to nationalism. Revolutionary nationalism is the major agenda of the day. And I think if we accept that as a profound change, then again, those within the Balkans may have been prepared to respond to that sort of chain of events, or indeed may well have taken the prevalence of those events in other parts of Europe as a sign, almost a biblical sign, that change was needed and revision, reform, a path for independence should be pursued in the context of specific parts of the Balkans as well. Now, that's a little bit speculative, but I don't think it's a huge leap of faith to make that sort of inferral about the cultural and religious landscape that we're seeing for our point of study. And just tied to that, just to reinforce, the church is of significant importance in a wider sense. Let me just double check. Yeah, okay. Serbian Uprising is what I want to finish this on. Importance of the church more generally, that is to say, and I alluded to this earlier as well, the church is the main conduit for education. In relation to that, it's also a voice of authority. So in terms of things like disputes, legal disputes, church is going to have a fairly influential role in that. The main figureheads in Balkan society are going to be heavily influenced, led by, motivated by religious thinking, Christian thinking, and so forth. But as I say, the really important thing is appreciating the relationship between educational institutions and the church, and that is very closely linked together. Now, that doesn't mean that there's an automatic rejection or hostility towards the Enlightenment. Many of the scholars who start adopting Enlightenment philosophies are religious figures. We have a number of bishops who start touring around the Balkans who are exploring elements of Enlightenment philosophy. And I think we've said before, if you think back to year one, an adoption of Enlightenment thinking doesn't preclude the retention of spiritual belief. You know, it's probably one of the more popular and slightly casual connections or links that's made. You adopt the Enlightenment, you reject religion. It's not quite so simple as that. And we see that in France during the Revolution. It's not quite so simple as just to say the church is, it's not like the church is shut down. And it's not like all of them are burnt down or destroyed. It's more a question of redressing the balance of power and the perception of authority. That it's not necessarily just the church who is able to pass ethical judgment on whatever circumstance might be up for discussion. So in the context of the Balkans, church is responsible for education, highly influential terminologies in the context of disputes, but also it is a conduit through which the Enlightenment can find expression as well. So the church is almost providing both aspects of the cultural discussion here. It is through the practice of religion lending itself to things like millennialism. It's feeding that, but it's also by virtue of being scholarly and educational in its motivation, also linking us into Enlightenment. And so where we start seeing the sort of exposure to new ways of thinking, new philosophies that might challenge, say, for instance, the authority of the Ottomans over these people within the Balkans. Essentially that discussion that the French had with themselves at the end of the 18th century. As we get into the start of the 19th, separated by several decades, but nonetheless that conversation begins to be explored within the context of the church and ecclesiastical figures. So we shouldn't understate the importance of the church in this context. Now, the one thing that I wanted to dwell on a little bit was to give you one specific case study, was to look at Serbia. So, I mean, in many respects, this is dealing with our sort of a combination of influential factors in one nutshell. So first, Serbian uprising, you've got your timescale here. We said it happens before the Greek War of Independence. The conclusion of it doesn't see Serbia secure independence, but it does see it establish a far more, what's the word I'm looking for? Autonomous state. So far more in the way of self-governance comes out of the ultimate aftermath of this. Now, a couple of important points. Again, highly religious nation. Caught myself out there, didn't I? Not nation. Highly religious region. Let's go with that. I think that's a more valid description of where we are at this point in time. But of course, what it's leading us to is that concept of nation. A couple of key points on the slides here. Small but influential group of Serbian patriots developed among the Hungarian Serbs. This highlights once more the point on things like Zadruga and migration. And in many respects, it echoes the narrative that we saw about exiles in relation to revolutionary trends in France, Germany, Italy, Poland as well. Very similar a trajectory here, that there are many who are going to influence what happens in relation to Serbian independence campaigns actually outside of Serbia at that point in time. Now, of course, Hungary's not far off, and you have blurred boundaries. So, how much weight do we want to put on that in terms of the narrative of the exile? We might want to tread cautiously about being overly vocal about it, but it's interesting that there are parallels to be drawn with what's happening with the aforementioned nations. You certainly have a group of what I describe in point 3 as sort of intellectual elites. I describe them here as Serbian Josephinists. So you have a brief period in terms of European monarchies where there are Enlightenment thinkers amongst the monarchy. I think we see this in a sort of an Austro-Hungarian context, where there are figureheads who are operating within what you would describe as the Ancien regime, but who are subscribers to Enlightenment philosophies. They are both political and social reformers. And so those ideas, when given voice by figureheads, then filter down into sort of the next tier of social elites. And in this instance, many prominent intellectual Serbians, highly influenced by what's happening in a Hungarian context, take those ideas and principles back into an Ottoman into a Serbian and, for this point in time, an Ottoman context. We do stress, sorry as I obscure my face here, I wasn't trying to do the slides. We do stress that there are degrees of autonomy, but in terms of what Serbia was looking for, an increased level of political autonomy. Things like freedom of press, and trying to challenge things like sorry, it's popped out my head. Forced labour. So I mean, Emperor Joseph was keen on these sorts of these points. So religious freedoms, ending what might be sort of serfdom, slavery, that sort of context. Introducing a more liberal approach to communication. These are all sort of points that are attractive in the context of what Hungarian Serbs are being exposed to, and bring those ideas back. Now, these ideas, I mean, they're not universally popular in an Austro-Hungarian context, it should be said. And Emperor Joseph sees quite a lot of sort of pushback in relation to that. However, not so much however, you also see pushback in an Ottoman context as well. Serbia is pushing probably a little bit too hard, too fast in terms of what Ottoman authorities are comfortable with. And that does lead to a protracted military engagement. So you're seeing essentially a war of independence running from, it's about 1804 to 1817. I'm not sure who did it. Oh, yeah. That's why those numbers ring a bell, because I wrote them down so I wouldn't have to remember. So that's your timescale for this War of Independence. Roughly in the middle of this, I want to say 1809. Yeah, 1809 for the Battle of Ċegar. This is one of these great moments of heroic sacrifice. This is a point where Serbian armed forces defending a hill are in the process of being overrun. That's what's being depicted here. And you have two different depictions of the Ottoman forces sweeping up this hilltop, scattering the Serbian forces until there's one general left. And I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce his name. Again, I've never heard it out loud, but it's in the notes and you can read about him at your leisure. But as I say, I'm far too sleep deprived to gamble on the pronunciation of this particular general. But in terms of the story, he makes the ultimate sacrifice. What you see behind the general, and it's interesting, the different depictions. One shows this cache just sort of upwards behind him, the other one shows it below. But this is a sort of a munitions cache, a store of gunpowder. And as the Ottomans charge up the hill to his final defensive position, he discharges a shot into the ammunition store and blows up the hill. Takes out everyone, himself, the Romanian Serbian forces, and a vast number of Ottomans who had been attacking the position. A great act of sacrifice. And of course, this is something that echoes back to points we've talked about in weeks 1, week 2, week 3. Think back to Benedict Anderson dying for the nation. Now, of course, are we at a point of nation here? I think the preoccupation is more about statehood than nation building, but that will come. Initially, we have this great act of sacrifice. The general lays down his life and undermines any sort of strategic advantage the Ottomans may have gained because of the loss of life of their own soldiers. What happens afterwards is really quite intriguing, because this is constructed not long after the battle takes place. Ottoman authorities create what is affectionately referred to as the Skull Tower. Not a huge amount of imagination put into the title of that, but nonetheless, it's sort of one of those classic say what you see things. This tower was constructed, and I've got some more images of it for you as well. Here's an image of it, and it's sort of, as it starts to decay, but it's still recognizable. 952 human skulls placed in this wall. And what we normally do at this stage is have the sort of the discussion of the why. Why did you do this? This is a fairly macabre thing to do, you know, for what we were describing earlier as the religiously tolerant Ottoman Empire. Why would they be doing this? Well, this is an act of control. This is communicating the consequences of military resistance to Ottoman authority. That if you just go along peaceably, don't challenge it, pay your taxes, pay your dues, you know, you can go on, worship whoever you want, how you want, and we won't have any problems. But if you challenge it, this is the consequence. That your skulls or your heads will be removed, they'll be defleshed, and they'll be placed on display for all passers-by to enjoy and see. Unsurprisingly, over time, this is another example, a little bit later on you'll appreciate this is a photograph now, as we get towards the end of the century, and it's much diminished at this point. So you see, I don't have a date on this particular etching, but it gives you a sense of the sort of the transition from where we were to this point. Most of the skulls lost at this point, and as we get towards the end of the century, the tower is actually reduced deliberately to some extent, but not by Serbians, by the Ottomans. The Ottomans appreciate that this tower, rather than be a mechanism of control, actually serves just to really piss off Serbians and strengthen their attitude of resolve against the Ottoman Empire. And this is what often happens in terms of mechanisms of punishment. This serves to strengthen a sense of Serbian identity, because you have this fixed point in the landscape where you can then go pay homage to your fallen comrades, fallen relatives, those who have made the sacrifice for what gradually becomes the concept of Serbia. So it sort of has the reverse effect. What the Ottomans were hoping would introduce a mechanism of control and subjugation, ultimately does the opposite. It strengthens hostility towards the Ottomans. So when we get to this stage, this is a little bit further on in the chronology. This is after a point when the Ottomans have reduced the site, so deliberately reduced it. Many of the skulls have been taken for reburial. Some, in a slightly grisly manner, have been taken as souvenirs. Others have simply just fallen, broken, decayed, as happens with a mud brick structure. No, I don't have a picture of it. No, I took it out because I think I had enough pictures of skull walls. Today, a portion... Actually, no, it's here. Today, the skull wall is within a church, what's left of it, with some heads still in situ. A church was then built around. So this is the first stage of the development. There was this construction put to safeguard the tower, because then it becomes a monument. It's one of those brilliant examples of monumental culture where something is introduced in the landscape which is supposed to be a social negative. Serbians aren't supposed to like this. It's supposed to be, this is terrible and scary. Let's make sure we stand in line and don't have this happen to us. But then over time it becomes a symbol of resistance. It's like, yeah, these guys laid down their lives for Serbia, and this is what we should do in the future. We should emulate this. This is something to aspire to. And it becomes safeguarded, and a Serbian church is built around the site, and it's preserved going forwards. So if you think back to what we did with monumental culture, there's another child outside. Come in, Maya. Think of what we did about monumental culture. This is the same thing, but happening in reverse process. I'm going to have to do a third part of this recording. We're so close to finishing. Okay. That was a shorter interlude on that occasion. That was about 5 minutes, and we're back to recording. But yeah, like I said, I was exclaiming because it was just like we were so close to finishing what I wanted to get recorded for. Now I've got 3 bits of video to stitch together, which is annoying. Makes more work than it needed to be. Anyway, so we've given you that sense of, I was talking about monumental culture in the context of Serbia and how this thing becomes a sort of a symbol of a sort of like a rallying structure towards the Serbian cause. So really interesting little example there. Now, we could talk a little bit more about the social context. Sorry, that's a bit messy. Can we make that tidier? That's better. Just highlighting, we mentioned earlier Enlightenment coming into a Serbian context. Archbishop of Buda. Stefan, should we give it a crack? Stratimirovic. I could well be right. It sounds good. I think those letters lead us to Stratimirovic. But again, religious figure. Exposed to Enlightenment philosophies, bringing those ideas into a religious context. So that's important. Some of the other things on here, I'm going to pass by a lot of this because I want to wrap this up. All this is just useful contextual and chronological detail that just highlights those wider factors that are feeding into the emergence of Enlightenment philosophies in the Balkans as we go to that transitional point from 18th to 19th century. So, we're citing here Greek merchants moving through the territory, having exposure to ideas that are playing out in a British and a French context by virtue of, the various military conflicts that are happening in this time, overlapping the sort of the territories that we're dealing with, changes in trade routes themselves, putting the Balkans in a more prominent position, and there being greater sort of footfall through that territory in terms of trade, and at the same time exposure to the sort of Enlightenment thinking that led other regions or states down a path of nationalism. So that's certainly playing its part. What I wanted to jump over to was this, and this is probably one of the sort of the last slides we can look at properly, was just to highlight the College of Belgrade opened in the middle of this period. So this is just before the Battle of Ċegar that we've talked about in terms of the Skull Wall and such. And this is part of a speech given to the first intake of students at this new, we call it a college. It's essentially a university. It's all sort of practical purposes. And Obradović here rallying the students by saying, "You will be the ones who will enlighten our nation." And there, critically, we get that first reference point in a Serbian context of this language of nation. Now, how broadly that's being applied is questionable, but it's always interesting to see where the first reference points to the idea of nation emerges. And we saw in a French context, the use of the word nation comes, in that revolutionary context. So in the same sort of, again, would we call this revolutionary, militarily? There is a period of tension between Serbians and Ottomans when this institution is created. So I think that's a very deliberate use of language, and fascinating to see it manifest in the context of an educational institution, which of course is still tied to religious influential figures as well. But here, you will enlighten our nation and lead it to every goodness, because by the time you will have become the people's headmen, judges and managers, the people's progress, honour and glory will depend on you. This is a nationalistic speech, preparing students for their role as figureheads of the new Serbian nation. This is an exercise in propaganda. It's conditioning. It's providing direction and focus for where these students are going to be going next. It is a work of nationalism and a really fascinating example to see. And again, a year before the Battle of what was it calling it? I was calling it Ċegar then. I was getting mixed up with other things. Ċegar. So you stitch these things together. We have Dying for the Nation, we have Enlightenment philosophy, we have the emergence of educational institutions which are overt in promoting a nationalist cause, and the creation of this idea of progress, honour and glory for a nation. So this is all coming out in this context. It is arguably slower for the Balkans than elsewhere, and Serbia is sort of ahead of the game for many other parts of the Balkans. Much of the rest of this paper, I'm not giving a paper, this lecture, this session, if we go through, much of the rest of the session focuses on Macedonia. And I'm not going to talk too much about that now. I'm probably going to leave the session around about this point, because we must have been going for well over an hour now. So perhaps some of the discussion points I'll give you in the forum will focus on what's happening in Macedonia. Because there we have a chronologically rich conceptual nation. And I say conceptual because, of course, there's lots of debate over who owns Philip the Great and... sorry, not Philip the Great. I'm mixing them up. Philip of Macedonia and then Alexander the Great, related, father-son. Lots of claims over who owns that part of Greek history. Is it the Greeks or is it the Macedonians? And of course, Macedonia no longer exists. Again, now it's North Macedonia, the great conquerors of Italian football teams. See, balance, karma, all these things balance each other out over time. But Macedonia becomes North Macedonia, a distinct entity which kind of geographically surrenders the inheritance of Alexander to the Greek people, to a sense. But in the campaign for the naming of Macedonia as North Macedonia, there was a lot of discussion given to these figures of Alexander, Philip of Macedonia, and remember what we talked about in the Welsh case study: depth. Same thing with museums, the use of history. It provides depth for an emergent nation. So this becomes really important for Macedonia. But for the period that we're looking at, it's really questionable how much consciousness there is of it because of those factors we talked about earlier. Nationalism in a Macedonian context comes so much later on because of, and I describe it here as melting pots. We have so many different cultural bodies within what would be the territory of Macedonia that it's really conflicted and quite messy. And I just cite at the end of this presentation that Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbians, Romanians and Albanians all lay claim to chunks of the Macedonian territory. And this is manifest in sort of ripe exploitation of Macedonia, with them sort of with many tied to the idea of Macedonia sort of being manipulated and sort of directed again into acts of hostility that really don't benefit them in any way. But yeah, I mean, like I said, there's lots more stuff in here which ends up with accusations of what we might describe as ethnic cleansing taking place in a Macedonian context, with different power players amongst other emergent nations essentially trying to clear land for their own people. So this ends up with quite a macabre narrative, which is sort of a precursor to what's taking place as we get towards the end of the first third into the middle part of the 20th century, with the same sort of narratives in a Germanic context. So there we go. As I say, there's lots more to be said. There's a good couple more hours of material that we could talk about. But what I hope I managed to give you is a sense of the complexity of the Balkans. We've only just touched the surface in terms of the use of language, for instance, but there's more to be said on that. But what I hope you'll appreciate is that the chronologies are different for this territory, that the social circumstances are quite different as well. The role of church is far more robust and longer running. The mobility of people is profoundly different. In a Western European context, people are far more rooted to specific locations. In a Balkans context, mobility, migration, the use of caravans and such for moving people from one place to another is a social norm. And in terms of the composition of community, family is far more profoundly important than state, nation, anything like that. So the circumstances are completely different. Nonetheless, the idea of nationalism will ultimately emerge. And it will emerge in a very similar way to that which we see in other earlier established European nations, namely the influence of Enlightenment thinking, pressure from external forces. Macedonia ultimately emerges as a nation in defiance against these cultural incursions from the more established nations, pressing in on the boundaries. It's that classic scenario. The more pressure you put on a people, the more likely they are to resist. And you sort of see that in the Ukrainian-Russian narrative today. I think Ukrainian nationalism is going to be far more relevant today than it was this time last year or 5-10 years ago, regardless of who's in power. Nationalism is enhanced as a political ideology when force pushes in against you. And I think that's what we're seeing quite clearly in the context of many of the states that emerge as nations within the Balkans. And on that, as light begins to fade outside, I'm going to call it a day. So I'm going to stitch this together, get it uploaded somewhere, and there'll be a discussion forum. I would like to think that this is going to get out to you tonight, as in Tuesday. All depends on upload speeds. We'll see how we go. It might be ready for you on Wednesday morning. But either way, I sincerely hope, because I put the time into it, that you work your way through the video. Always appreciated if you do that. I will have a discussion forum set up to discuss some of the themes that are explored in the slides that we've covered and some of the others. And fingers crossed, we will get a chance to discuss this over the coming weeks. We're going to have a 4-week break coming up, so I will be in touch about some of the things that we will look to try and do during that 4-week break. But for now, I will say a final apology that I wasn't able to be with you today. Everything seems fine at home now. Hours after the event, I think everything's okay. But it was sensible to come back. And my thanks. Hope you enjoyed it. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you a month from now, or whenever this crazy break comes to an end. All right. Bye for now, guys. See you soon.